It's a great honor to introduce David Satter, who is the only American journalist expelled from Russia. Mr. Satter is also a Babel man, a former Financial Times Moscow correspondent, a Rhodes Scholar from 1968, and quite interestingly, the author of 5 books on Russia and the former USSR. Mr. Satter, we very much look forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks to all of you for coming and for offering some competition to the uncomfortable Oxford tour, which has enlightened everybody about homophobic, misogynist, colonialist, racist Oxford. By the time they get done, I wonder why anyone would ever want to come to this place, let alone aspire to study here. I'm the co-chairman of the Alliance of Rhodes Scholars, and this is quite by accident. It's the first executive position I've had since I was editor of the school newspaper at the University of Chicago more than 50 years ago. So it's a new experience for me, but speaking isn't. What the point we want to make is that the pursuit of diversity and the pursuit of excellence are really two different things. They require different criteria, a different commitment, and even a different psychology. It's a normal characteristic of people of all ages who have idealistic motivation to try to find some sense of meaning in their lives. This is one of the most noble aspects of human nature, but it's also one of the most dangerous, because many people are led astray and they seek meaning in those situations where it cannot be found. What we have now is the rise of genuine victim culture. And it's victim culture in those nations that are democratic, that are law-based. Those countries in the global south and those lawless, aggressive countries that are trying to upset the international order, they're not concerned with victim culture. The victim culture that we're dealing with in this country is a self-absorbed phenomenon in which people look for oppression and discrimination at the expense of the profound achievements of Western civilization, on which, in fact, the entire world, not just the West, depends. The idea, the sympathy for the weak and the desire to remedy the condition of the disadvantaged is a very important and noble aspiration. But bear in mind that it has led to extraordinary crimes. Karl Marx himself was motivated by deep concern over the abuses of the early industrial age, and particularly the use of child labor. He was influenced by Frederick Engels' books, The Situation of the Working Class in England, which contains really horrific tales of the exploitation of workers in the early days of the factory system. But by idealizing the working class and making it the center of an entire system of interpretation, he created an ideology which eventually led to the murder of millions. It seems unnatural to glorify marginalization, but in fact, it is a very powerful temptation. In the first place, victim culture almost inevitably involves certain tangible consequences. Now, we would hope that for most people, simple self-respect would prevent someone from seeking a position on the basis of his race, sex, or supposed disadvantage or marginalization. But in fact, that's true of a minority of people. Many people are on the contrary, concerned simply with consequences and results. And if they see that there's an advantage for them to a system which glorifies victimhood, they will find rationalities for rationalizations for any indignities that seem to accompany it. At the same time, victim culture is an advantage for those who propound it. Ideologies always operate on the basis of a very few simple propositions that people learn and repeat uncritically. What makes them powerful is they're backed up by mass psychology. In the case of victim culture, it's possible to consider yourself extremely virtuous, to be self-satisfied without having to demonstrate either intellect or genuine courage. The fact is that many people don't understand that virtue and virtue signaling are not the same thing. For many people, it's simply enough to demonstrate virtue by shouting down someone you don't agree with, by taking part in a demonstration that you don't fully understand, by putting signs up in your window or sticking, or in your lawn. But this, in effect, this really is not a significant demonstration of virtue. It was Ralph Ellison, in The Invisible Man, the classic novel, who understood that oftentimes the people who are the most passionate advocates of Black people are often really concerned, first of all, with themselves. So the first lines of The Invisible Man are, "You look at me, but you don't see me. I'm actually a genuine man, and I can be even thought to have a mind. But when you look at me, you see only yourself." And the final reason why victim culture is in fact appealing to people is that it relieves them of the obligation to think. With the help of extreme oversimplification, it describes the world as a struggle between victims and victimizers, with the needs of the former shielded from evaluation according to a transcendent ethical standard. The dialogic process of judgment is replaced with the repetition of easy-to-understand formulas which have, in reality, little meaning. The result is to deepen conflicts and make them intractable. In the final analysis, the adept of victim culture is equipped to talk only to himself. As we're gathered now here in Oxford to renew friendships, those of us who are Rhodes Scholars, to commemorate the achievement that this Rhodes Scholarship represents. But there's little doubt that victim culture has now taken over the Rhodes Scholarship. For one thing, in this celebration, we are not here alone. In addition to the 120th anniversary of the Rhodes Scholarship, we're supposedly celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Mandela Rhodes Foundation and the 5th anniversary of the RISE program. What are these programs? The Mandela Rhodes Foundation was created with the help of John Rowett, the former warden of Rhodes House, who unsurprisingly became the new foundation's director. Rowett successfully transferred $16.6 million to the Mandela Rhodes Foundation to support education in South Africa, which is not a bad thing, of course, in and of itself, although there's nothing in Rhodes's will to suggest that this is what he intended. The Rhodes Mandela Foundation, without authorization, describes this money as reparations. We do not describe it as reparations on the Rhodes site for all of the other things that are on that site. The RISE program is even more problematic. It provides lifetime support for high school students between the ages of 15 and 17 from any country who were, quote, never discovered, became isolated at a young age, lacked access to opportunities to develop their ideas, or faced social and economic barriers. Dennis Blair, who is the co-chairman of the Alliance of Rhodes Scholars, wrote in a letter to the Rhodes Trust, attempting to identify future leaders among those who have not demonstrated potential by any other means in high school is an experiment the Rhodes Trust has no responsibility to undertake. The warden of the Rhodes House, Elizabeth Quiche, with whom I've been in contact, and the chairman of the trustees, Sir John Bell, who has spoken to Dennis Blair, leave very little doubt that victim culture is now the Rhodes Scholarship's animating philosophy. They write, "We cannot reconcile or heal if we do not acknowledge and see." They state that racism and other forms of exclusion have played a significant role in the history of the Rhodes Trust, and conclude that the scholarship must fight to eradicate racism. They offer no examples of the racism that supposedly played a role in the history of the trust, nor do they mention the real purpose of the Rhodes Scholarship, as described in Rhodes's will, which is to foster excellence and leadership. They state that although they accepted their positions voluntarily as the leaders of the Rhodes Trust, they state that they're driven to confront the legacies of slavery, imperialism, and white supremacy. As a result of the Rhodes Scholarship's complicated legacy, which apparently didn't bother them before they accepted their positions, and play a proactive role in this work. Well, the actions of the trustees have not been without consequences. In the first place, there's been a devastating effect on the selection process. The trust has insisted publicly, and Elizabeth insisted in a letter in response to my article in the Wall Street Journal, that there's no affirmative action, there's no preference and consideration of race, that balance and diversity are not factors in selection. But in their statement on equity and inclusion, Elizabeth and Sir John vow to, quote, assess the diversity of application pools across all constituencies, diversify and train our selectors, and reach out to students from historically marginalized communities. In the press releases announcing the selection of a new class, the only thing they mention is race and gender. In the press release for 2020, for example, they wrote, it was written, 21 of the 32 winners, that's more than 2/3, unless my arithmetic is off, are students of color, 10 are black, equal to the greatest number ever elected in 1 year in the United States. 15 are first-generation Americans or immigrants, and 1 is a dreamer with active DACA status. 17 of the winners are women, 14 are men, 1 is non-binary. No mention of interests or accomplishments. Rhodes publications in the past, they provided information, but they indicated no preference for any particular type of candidate. But the Rhodes site and almost all publications and statements by trust officials today make clear that the trust is seeking women and minorities. The most recent announcement of the competition featured a lead photo of 9 scholars, not one of whom is a white male. Such an announcement should contain a picture of Oxford, the university, the city, the classroom, some activity here. They don't even show students engaged in some meaningful activity. Publications of this kind discourage those in the non-preferred categories because, let's face it, who is it who's going to want to go to the trouble of applying for a Rhodes Scholarship, with all that that entails, if he's warned in advance through not very subtle signals that the competition is not going to be fair, and it's going to be based on things that are absolutely beyond his control. The emphasis to giving scholarships to women and minorities is apparently accompanied by discrimination against candidates who are politically conservative. Glenn Lurie, an African-American economist at Brown University, said he was disgusted by the failure of a student he described as a once or twice in a lifetime talent to make any headway in the Rhodes competition. A former Rhodes scholar who recruited for the scholarship at a small conservative college wrote, "None of those we had nominated received an interview. Some were absolutely superb, and on a number of occasions, we had people interviewed for the Marshall, but I have no doubt that we were blacklisted. The apparent discrimination against conservative candidates is not a matter of the war between Democrats and Republicans, but rather the necessary creation of intellectual interchange in a situation in which people are obliged to test their opinions and reason logically and persuasively. Eliminating, in the present situation that exists in American universities that are dominated by victim culture and mass psychology, a conservative student, particularly one who demonstrates real intellectual ability, is a potential asset, because not only for anything that he may do, but for his ability to force other people or to inspire other people to think. Victim culture inspires an insular psychology that can have really not only embarrassing, but very damaging consequences. In January 2022, Mackenzie Fierstein, a Rhodes scholar who claimed she grew up poor and in foster care, lost her scholarship after officials of the trust learned she had in fact grown up in a comfortable middle-class St. Louis area home and had attended a $30,000 a year private school. Fierstein told a story of adversity, being shuttled from house to house while in foster care with only her clothes, which she carried with her in garbage bags. She identified herself as queer, low income, and a first-generation student. Only the first description was true. She was exposed after articles about her appeared, and people who knew her wrote to the Rhodes Trust exposing her fabrications. 89 Rhodes scholars, 65 of whom came up in the last 4 years, wrote a letter in support of Mackenzie, denouncing the action of the Rhodes Trust in asking her to give back her scholarship and asserting that the Rhodes Trust was guilty of basing its conclusion on facts and not paying sufficient attention to Mackenzie's truth, her own truth, different from the real truth, or the truth that most people accept. Now, there are lots of people outside of Oxford and outside of this situation who have their own versions of the truth. For example, Vladimir Putin has his truth too. And but one of the conditions for receiving a Rhodes Scholarship is fidelity to the truth. And in general, one of the conditions of civilization is understanding the absolute value of truth. The idea that it has been said, including by the leaders of the Alumni Association, that the competition for the Rhodes Scholarship is fiercer than ever. But if in recent years we have 89 Rhodes Scholars who are ready to sign a petition in which they assume that someone is entitled to his own version of truth, that calls into question the integrity and the effectiveness of the entire selection process. In addition, the Rhodes Trust has instituted a kind of program of indoctrination for the Rhodes Scholars. There is now a code of conduct for Rhodes Scholars that they're obliged to sign. It's devised by the Rhodes Trust, and it bans all kinds of bad activities such as fraud, sexual violence. It was explained that that the warden decided on this step after heeding calls from members of the community who said that this was necessary. I would like to know what segment of the community originated these calls, and why the warden found it necessary to accede to them. In any case, this is the kind of indoctrination that exists in a totalitarian country, and I'm in a position to talk about this because I lived for 6 years in the Soviet Union and I witnessed it. This type of forcible inculcation of a message that doesn't make sense is a way not to persuade people, but to subordinate them. And to diminish their sense of their own autonomy and freedom. Rhodes Scholars are also now participate in various retreats in which members of the Rhodes staff opine on what are deemed to be important personal and political issues. In one such retreat led by Doyen Atawalogan, the Dean of the Rhodes Scholarships, the topic was "No One Way to Lead." Dr. Atawalogan is described as an internationally recognized expert on leadership, diversity, and intersectionality, and the Rhodes Scholars at the retreat were fully exposed to her views. According to the Rhodes Scholar magazine, the retreat disrupted the assumption of the heroic model of leadership that draws on the white male as the normative form of leadership. It challenged the notion that dominance, heroism, and leading from the front are the only legitimate forms of leadership. According to the magazine, it grappled with the ethics of leadership as verb, not noun, whatever that means, contended with uncertainty and not knowing, and leaned into community instead of adopting an individualistic style of leadership. Celebrated the idea of leadership as everyday acts of service rather than individual acts of heroism. Now, overlooking the fact that Dr. Atawalogan clearly thinks in unacceptable racial categories, and a dean in charge of diversity is actually unnecessary if, as Elizabeth has insisted, there's no affirmative action in the selection of candidates. This notion of leadership is simply the opposite of what is expected of Rhodes Scholars and what is predominantly accepted in the rest of the world. Speaking of my own experience in Russia, Ukraine, and the Soviet Union, standing in those persons who were able to stand up to a totalitarian machine did so as individuals. For example, Dr. Andrei Sakharov. Leadership is almost always a matter of individuals. A crowd is organized to follow. We've had a recent example of this in the war in Ukraine. If Volodymyr Zelensky had followed the idea that you lead from behind, and he would not have returned to Ukraine to rally the resistance to the Russian invasion, and the Ukrainian resistance would have collapsed. So as we consider the future of the Rhodes Scholarship and the threat posed to it, I want to cite one other factor, which is the experience of 19th century Russia, which is actually very, very relevant to what we face today. Educated society in Russia in the 19th century was gripped by an idealization of the peasantry and a desire to atone for past oppression. The collective fever was nearly eschatological. After the liberation of the serfs in Russia in 1861, young people flocked to the countryside to raise the consciousness of the peasants and incite them against the rule of the Tsar. Unfortunately, the Going to the People movement was based on a very imperfect understanding of the peasants that Russia's young radicals were trying to save. The peasants reacted to the populace with extreme suspicion and often turned them into the police. This led to the first large number of political prisoners, the radicalization, and the birth of the modern world's first organized terrorist movement. On January 28, 1878, Fyodor Trepov, the governor of St. Petersburg, was receiving petitions in his office. One of the petitioners, a young woman named Vera Zasulich, handed Trepov a petition, and he began to study it. He then looked up and she pulled out a pistol and shot him. She waited to be arrested. She told investigators that although she had never met Trepov before, she shot him because of his brutal treatment of political prisoners. In fact, reports to this effect had been exaggerated. Huge crowds gathered for Zasulich's trial. Confident of the attitude of the public, the Tsarist authorities agreed to a trial by jury. Zasulich expected to be hanged after a staged trial. Instead, she was acquitted after a defense speech that emphasized not her innocence, but her lofty motives. There was pandemonium and congratulations outside the courthouse. The notion of trial by justice, as the radicals and their liberal supporters understood it, triumphed over trial by law and a legal precedent that had been created for the right to shoot someone out of your convictions. At that moment, in the words of the Russian historian Edward Rodzinski, the clock of revolution began to tick. Without fully realizing it, educated Russian society and its overwhelming sympathy for the oppressed had lost its commitment to morality, fairness, and truth. When the armed supporters of the underprivileged seized power, supposedly in the name of the underprivileged, supposedly in their name, the moral base of society, potentially capable of inspiring resistance, was gone. Fanatics acting in the name of the oppressed proceeded to inflict a holocaust on the entire population. The echoes of what happened reverberate today. As the Russia-Ukraine war enters its 16th month, we stand amazed at the readiness of the Russian population to support an unprovoked war of aggression that is costing tens of thousands of lives. But we should not be surprised. The capacity for individual moral judgment was destroyed in Russia in wave upon wave of murderous assaults carried out by a lawless regime. The tragedy of Ukraine is the legacy of a situation in which sympathy for the underprivileged and hatred of Tsardom was more important than a commitment to the truth. Fortunately, there's little danger that this will be repeated in the US and the UK. But this is because our systems are rooted in a pre-existing commitment to universal values. The victim culture that's now sweeping the US and the UK will not destroy those institutions, but it remains dangerous because it will corrupt them from within. This is what's happening with the Rhodes Scholarship. I spent some of the best years of my life in Oxford. And I didn't follow the affairs of this scholarship until 2 years ago when I began to read the publications coming out of Rhodes House. My strong feeling was that the warden and the trustees are responsible for administering the scholarship on the basis of Cecil Rhodes's will, not transforming it to conform to the mass psychology that is sweeping American education. That's why I wrote the article about the situation with the scholarship in the Wall Street Journal. That's why we formed the Rhodes Scholars Alliance. That's why we're seeking help in organizing activities, and why we wish to engage with the Rhodes Trust, with Elizabeth, with Sir John Bell, to return the Rhodes Scholarship to its founding principles for the benefit of everyone. In his book *Sapiens*, the Israeli writer Yuval Noah Harari wrote, "Today, humankind has broken the law of the jungle. there's at least real peace, and not just the absence of war. Never before has peace been so prevalent that people could not even imagine war. In periods of peace, of course, it's hard to imagine war, just as in periods of health, it's difficult to imagine sickness. But as events in Russia and Ukraine show, and which, by the way, are extremely dangerous and may threaten the whole world, war, chaos, mass murder, authoritarian rule remain an active possibility. They require the resistance of people with the best education, the best will, and the most reliable sense of integrity. That's why the Rhodes Scholarship is still important and needs to be preserved. It was the purpose of the Rhodes Scholarship to cultivate such leaders in the past. They are as necessary now as they were then. Thank you.